A talking snake deceives a couple in a paradisiacal garden. If you take a moment to think about it, this seems like a fable or a children's tale, but this is the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis of the Holy Bible. How can we believe that man and woman emerged in this way? It would be more or less like reading the story of the three little pigs and believing that pigs truly speak. So how can we believe that a snake would also speak? Was what Moses wrote in Genesis 1 and 2 merely a fable and not a historical fact? Was this the first account of human creation? Or, as some people say, did the Hebrews copy ancient Sumerian legends? What was the true origin of Adam? The truth is that many Christian theologians say we should disregard this part of Genesis as a historical account, and that it was merely an ancient poem of the Hebrew people, something like a metaphor, a legend for their people. Another hypothesis was raised by author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the famous Chronicles of Narnia. He went as far as to say that Adam was the first modern specimen of Homo sapiens, the first who could think for himself and evolve. Clear attempt to join the Bible with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. In this case, Adam would be the result of the evolution of hominids that came before him, such as Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalensis, a process that would take millions of years from the most primitive form to reach Adam. But the problem with this thought, which would be a way to rationally defend the Bible, is that it leads to another very big problem. If Adam was a consequence of evolution, and there was no original sin from disobeying God by eating the forbidden fruit, why did Jesus die on the cross to redeem people from a transgression that never existed? It would make no sense for his sacrifice on the cross. Following that reasoning, do we have to believe in this story of the talking snake and the man made of clay? So, let's go. If we think this really happened, there has to be some historical record outside the Bible that proves it. It would make no sense for a man named Moses, who lived 1500 years before Christ, when writing already existed, to report this story, and no one before him even mentioned that fact. So, we have to investigate this theme further and reach the first historical account we know of to discover where Adam came from. If only Moses had reported about this, some might have said it could have been an invention, an appeal only to faith, but if we find more people before him reporting the same fact, then we would have to, at least, consider the hypothesis of the text, despite seeming a bit strange to the modern human, at least to consider the hypothesis of having been real. But logically, two people telling the same story never coincide in everything. There are always some contradictions. For example, if your grandfather and your father tell the same story of when they were young, you will hear the same story, but with different views. Going back 3,000 years before Christ, that is, 1,500 years before the birth of Moses, in ancient Mesopotamia, we find accounts very similar to that of Adam. In an archaeological excavation, thousands of cuneiform tablets were found, some receipts, laws, letters, and, to many's surprise, accounts of what would be the dawn of humanity, very similar to what would be written in Genesis. The ancient Egyptians wrote about the first human being of humanity, and he was known by various names: Adamu, Adimu, Adapa, and others. Names very similar to that of Adam, right? This is common. Generally, a name changes among different countries. John, for example, can be called Juan, depending on the country, but it's the same name. The tablets revealed that for many years there had already been a tradition of the people of Mesopotamia about the ancestor of all human beings, who was called Adapa. 4 fragments of this story were found. The original poem talks about eternal life. Adapa, as described in the cuneiform tablets found in ancient ruins, was a servant of the god Ea, or Enki for the Sumerians, deity of the waters, wisdom, and creation. Here we already have something similar to Genesis, in which the Spirit of God at the beginning of everything was moving over the waters. Enki lived in Eridu, one of the first cities in human history. It's worth noting that Eridu and Eden or Edenu mean the same thing, that is, paradise. With an intelligence and wisdom out of the ordinary, Adapa was seen as a model of a faithful servant, dedicating his life to temple service and the worship of his god. Ea, impressed with his devotion and understanding, shared celestial knowledge with Adapa, but did not grant him immortality, a decision whose consequences would be eternal. One day, while sailing the waters to fish, Adapa was surprised by a violent storm caused by the south wind. In an act of extraordinary strength, perhaps out of his anger or desperation, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, calming the storm, but also interrupting the winds that were vital to the region's life. Anu, the god of the heavens, surprised and angered by the audacity of a mortal interfering in divine matters, summoned Adapa to his celestial presence for judgment. Before the trial, Ea taught Adapa how to behave in front of Anu and warned him to refuse any offer of food or drink, as they could be a means to ensure his definitive death, since those foods were exclusive to the gods. Upon reaching the heavens, Adapa met Anu, who, curious about the wisdom and courage of a mortal, asked why he had broken the wing of the south wind. After hearing Adapa's sincere explanation, Anu, instead of punishing him, decided to offer him the food of life and the water of life as recognition of his wisdom and service. Here we also remember that passage from Genesis 3, where the serpent tells Eve that if she ate the fruit she would not die, but would be like God. However, following Ea's advice, Adapa refused the gifts, thus losing the opportunity to gain immortality. Anu, realizing Ea's influence on Adapa and admired by his loyalty, allowed Adapa to return to Earth, but as a mortal. There are also other similar stories in the Middle East, very similar to the story of Adam, such as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where his friend Enkidu is seduced by a priestess of the goddess Ishtar. Afterward, he gains full knowledge, again something similar to the Bible, when it talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. Many of these tablets also mention the flood and the Tower of Babel, showing even more similarities with the book of Genesis. What these poems have in common is the creation of a human couple that loses paradise due to disobedience, and a curse that ultimately brings the mortality of the human being. After all those tablets were found, denying the fact that virtually every ancient population mentioned the same fact of the creation of the first adult human being by God is not possible, suggesting that the event of Genesis did indeed occur. But then another problem arose. Many who previously said the story was false now say that the event could have existed, but that the Sumerian myths are original and that Genesis would be a plagiarism. But as I explained in another video, according to Kenneth Kitchen, a professor of Egyptology, the rule in the ancient East was that whenever a copy of a myth was made, it added various details to the story. That is, it placed many elements that did not exist in the original. So the Bible was not written to plagiarize, but to correct the errors that these myths were making. Remembering that after the flood, the population that remained separated and moved away from the knowledge of their ancestors, thus monotheism that was practiced before by the people gave way to pagan polytheism, changing the original story, corrected by Moses in the book of Genesis. But what about you? Did you know these stories? Want to know more stories like this? Then leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.